This video is designed to help you better understand what prepaid interest, also known as capitalized interest, is on PACE financing. Let's get started. Due to the structure of PACE financing, there's a gap between when PACE financing funds and when the initial annual payment is due on your property tax bill. For example, with a mortgage, if you close in the middle of the month, you might have a month or two before your first payment is due. When you make your first payment, you are paying in advance for the following period. Since no interest is collected between your closing date and your first payment due, this interest is rolled into your closing costs or total loan amount. It's the same concept with PACE financing. The difference is that PACE may have a long gap of time in which interest accrues due to annual property tax schedules. The sum of this interest is prepaid interest. It is a necessary piece of PACE financing. The prepaid interest shown on your financing estimate represents the highest possible scenario for estimation purposes. Prepaid interest does not accrue during the time your contractor is installing your home improvement. It begins to accrue after the project is completed and funded. Your actual prepaid interest, overall amount financed, and annual payment will be adjusted accordingly once your project funds. You will receive final documentation detailing these actual figures after your project is completed and funded. The total prepaid interest is included in your total financed amount. Thus, the total prepaid interest, the cost of your improvements, and your financing costs are included in your annual payments over the term of your PACE financing. Each county defines a date for which property taxes are calculated for the prior year. To determine which tax year your first payment will appear, we have a tax roll cutoff date for each county. This date determines which property tax year your first payment will appear on and how much prepaid interest will accrue. There are two potential scenarios related to tax roll cutoff dates in your county and your PACE application. The first is if the window for when your project will fund does not span the tax roll cutoff date in your county. This is usually if your project funds in the autumn or winter. The second is when your application does span the tax roll cutoff in your county. This is usually if your project funds in the spring and early summer. In the first scenario, when your funding date does not span the tax roll cutoff, the total prepaid interest decreases as the gap between the project funding date and the first payment due date decreases. So, the prepaid interest may be lower depending on when your project funds. In the second scenario, if your funding date is before the tax roll cutoff, your first payment will be on the current year's property tax bill. If your funding date is after the tax roll cutoff, your first payment will be a year later, the next year's tax bill. If your project funds before the tax roll cutoff, you will accrue less prepaid interest because your first payment is on this year's tax bill. If your project funds after the tax roll cutoff, you will accrue more prepaid interest, but your first payment will be further out on next year's tax bill. Please note that prepaid interest on your financing estimate represents the highest possible amount for estimation purposes. The actual prepaid interest amount may be lower. Your funding date is set after the contractor finishes the project and submits all documentation to Renew Financial. You approve the project by signing the completion certificate. Renew Financial reviews and approves the final documentation. Thank you so much for your time today. If you have any questions, please contact Renew Financial.